Okay, I think we should make a start. Yes, let's just first dedicate the share. The share is Nilui Nishmas Esther Rivka Bas Rav Moshe Halevi, Mrs. Fachla's mother. We wish her Erichas Yomim, and should be the Torah that we learn together this evening should be Nilui Nishmas, her mother. So let me begin by sharing with you a Kli Yakar, because I think the Kli Yakar here at the beginning of the parsha gives us a perspective which is particularly important in the transition that this parsha represents between obviously Mitzrayim and right at the end of the parsha all the way to Amalek. This is the journey that I want to sort of, if you like, go on this share. You'll see how we develop the idea. But the Kli Yakar begins. It's a short piece. It's on Pasuk Yotes. Moshe takes the bones of Yosef with him. Says the Kli Yakar, Somach inyan zel pasuk shelamala v'chamushim alu v'nei Yisrael. What is the connection with v'chamushim alu v'nei Yisrael? What has it got to do with the fact that they left armed? Different pshat in what v'chamushim means. Let's take Rashi's pshat, they left armed. And he says like this, because there's a Yalkut, there's a Medrash which says that throughout the journey in the Midbar, there were two aronos, there were two coffins, there were two aronos, not coffins, boxes, as you'll see what he means. He says like this, there's the aron hashchina, there's the aron of the Shechina, the arono shel Yosef, and the arono shel Yosef. It's a beautiful medrash. And all the ummos, the peoples would ask, the nations would ask, Ma tivoy shel arono shel meis, aron chayolamim. You must have made a mistake. How on earth could you put, you're carrying only two aronos, the aron or Elokim, the aron with the luchos, and you're carrying an aron with a person who's passed away. How can you carry the two together? And they would answer as follows: that this individual, why we're carrying this individual, why we're carrying this Aron, because Yosef fulfilled all the Aseres HaDibros. And therefore the symbolism, the idea by Kach Moshe Atzmos Yosef Imoi, was in order to provide a means of demonstrating that the Ikka, the main thing, was always going to be the carrying out of it. And the people would see Yosef's Aron being carried, and they would ask, how on earth could you carry someone together with the Aron or Elokim, a person? What's the connection? The answer is because this individual fulfilled what is written in the Aseres HaDibros. And he says that, of course, before Matan Torah, he says, Eich Olu Chamushim. How could they go up armed? He says, Haloi Adain Lo Hoya Aron HaKodesh Imoy. It wasn't yet with them. And that's why it says, Al Kain Oma Vayikach Moshe Atzmos Yosef Imo Ki Aron Shel Yosef Oyodoma Ki Lo Oyu Chakukim By Kol Aseres HaDibros. Before the Aron HaElokim enters the scene, before the Aron with the Aseres HaDibros is given to the Bnei Yisrael, all they have is Aron Shel Yosef, because the Aron Shel Yosef represents an individual who lived his life by the Torah, and that message is there to such an extent that even before it's paired, if you like, with the Aron Elokim, it's as if that is sufficient almost in its own right. It's quite a remarkable piece. It's a very brief piece of the Kli Yakar, and I think the reason why it's particularly poignant is because the idea of the Atzmos Yosef is not only ki hashpea hishpia, they committed, but it was meant to be a lesson. It was meant to be a message, an idea, an example, that everything they would learn as a people was not about simply the it was about putting it into practice. It was about living the life. And that was the message of the Aron Shel Yosef, with everything Yosef went through in his life, the tests and trials here. The fact is, he remained the image, he remained the one who represented that. And then, of course, you have the promise itself. So the Torah continues by saying, Pasuk Yotes, Vayikach Moshe Zemoki Ashbea Ishpias Bnei Yisrael Emar, Pokoid Yifkoid Elokim Eschem. Hashem will remember you. He had transferred that promise to them. You will leave. And when you go, you need to take me with you in this way. So Rav Moshe Feinstein in Darash Moshe points out like this. On the Pasuk later on, Perek Yudalet, Pasuk Tesvav, when Hashem turns round to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, Vayom Hashem al Moshe, Ma titzak Eloi. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yisol. Tell them to move. Tell them to go. Don't hang around. This is not the time for davening. This matitzak Eloi. This is a time to move. Says Reb Moshe like this, that they knew they would come to Eretz Yisrael. They knew. There wasn't a doubt that they would come. They'd been promised. They knew Hashem would remember them. They'd been given this mission to carry the Atzmos Yosef. He doesn't mention it specifically, but that's the link to that. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They knew they wouldn't die in the Midbar. They knew that all of the miracles that they had experienced couldn't be for nothing. So he says that we learn from here, the whole idea is, and the reason why it's spelled out in this way, is that a person has to have an ideal to do something, and then trust that it will transpire. Even if, based on the derech hateva, the normal way of things, there's no way of seeing how that can possibly help. He can't see how it's possible. Nevertheless, and he gives the example of founding a yeshiva, he says this is something which is incredibly difficult to do, and the only way you can do so is because of a promise. It will not be forgotten. There will not be, it will happen. The Torah will continue. And that's how it works. And therefore, a person, he says, is Rashay Muchiyav Lismoich Shavada Yatzliach Kizer Ritzoni Yisparach. He is allowed and in fact obligated to rely that it will indeed transpire. The Matitzak Eloi, according to this, is turning around to the Bnei Yisrael and saying, you know that it's going to happen. You know that it's going to be okay. The fact that you can't see how it's going to transpire or how you're going to get to the end result, the end goal, should never prevent you taking those steps. That's the message. Once you carry that promise with you that you will be able to do it, you should make sure that you stick to the course to have that faith in order to do so. Now, the main piece that I want to develop begins with the Shira. Rav Shimon Schwab in his Perush on Tefillah, a sefer which I've quoted in the past. If you haven't seen it, it's very, very, really worthwhile getting of Schwab on Tefillah. It's a collection of shiurim that he gave on in his shul in Washington. Where is it? In Washington Heights. Yes, in Washington Heights. Yeah, on Tefillah, series of shiurim that he gave, and he has he points out something which I certainly have never noticed. Despite it's like all these things, you see something and you daven every single day. We say the Shiras Hayom every day. We say the Shira, and yet there's something so obvious about it that we just don't even notice. And he says like this. He says that if you look at the entire Shira, it's 20 psukim. Kriyas Yamsuf, the actual miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf, is mentioned once, only once. Isn't that amazing? A blast from your nostrils, so to speak. It says the waters were heaped up. It's as straight as a wall, right? They congealed. That posuk is the only posuk which describes the actual miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf. And even there, it's in a sort of roundabout way. It's so straight as a wall. It doesn't specifically mention the word Kriyas Yamsuf. It doesn't. It's described in a very sort of oblique way. So what is the focus of the Shira? And again, this is where zooming out is so helpful, which is what he does. The focus of the Shira is on the sea returning to its natural state, on effectively the perishing of the Egyptians, which is mentioned many times throughout the Shira, the way, the description in how they perished and what happened, how the water came back. That if you look through the Shira, that's what you find. Look at the Shira that Miriam sings. Vatan lahem Miriam Shur Hashem. That's all it talks about. The perishing of the Egyptians in the sea. So the question is, why? Why is it that the focus of the Shira is on the destruction of the Egyptians and isn't on the actual nace, the actual miracle, the passing through the Yamsuf? Rav Shimon Schwab answers this by referring to the famous Gemara in Pesachim, which says, "Kashim Zonos Rishon Kriyas Yamsuf." A person's sustenance is as difficult as Kriyas Yamsuf. There are other examples as well, as we know, Shidduchim. There are things that are very difficult, as difficult to achieve as Kriyas Yamsuf. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? Clearly, it doesn't mean it's difficult for Hashem to perform Kriyas Yamsuf, obviously, right? It means that we can't comprehend it. We cannot comprehend the miraculous to the fullest extent. We can't get our heads around it. We're not built to understand how a miracle that goes against nature is possible to occur. What we can understand is a natural event. But the supernatural, it defies us, defies human understanding. That's why it's as difficult as Kriyas Yamsuf for us to perceive. So he says like this: there are two parts to the miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf. The first is supernatural. That's the parting of the water. That's supernatural. That is something which effectively was beyond the comprehension of the Bnei Yisrael. It could not be described directly in human terms in the Shira, because they weren't able to express that level of a miracle. It was beyond human comprehension. They knew it had transpired, but they couldn't put it into words in the Shira. The second part, though, was when Moshe Rabbeinu lifts his arm towards the sea and the water comes back down, drowning the Egyptians, drowning the Mitzrayim. What happens at that moment? At that moment, HaKadosh Baruch Hu returns the laws of nature to their normal function for the benefit of Bnei Israel, and that is the theme of the Shira. The theme of the Shira is Hashem returning the laws of nature to normal on our behalf. And why do I say that I think this is such an important and profound idea, apart from the fact that it's just a very straightforward and important, shot just in the Shira, well, what exactly the focus of the Shira is, but there's something more, I think, more fundamental here. According to this, what the Shira does is it sets up the beginning of the existence of Klal Yisrael living according to the natural order, as opposed to the supernatural. It's a Shira for the returning of the waters to normal under the direct direction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The water going back in was how water should normally do. Water should normally go back in. It shouldn't be there in water. That was the nace. The Shira is focused on the fact that it returned for our benefit. And if you look through the rest of the Parsha, you find this theme, I think, on at least 3 further occasions. The idea of Klal Yisrael beginning to understand how they are meant to live in this world, in the world of Teva, and not in the supernatural world. Example number 1, you look at the Tzinsenes Hamon, right? The idea of the Tzinsenes Hamon. If you think about it, it's a very strange idea. Why was it that there was a need to preserve the mon forever? And Rashi has this problem. If you look at you want to see it inside, Rashi is on Parak Tazayin Pasuk Lamed Hey. It says the Bnei Yisrael consumed the mon for 40 years until they came El Eretz Noshoves. El Eretz Noshoves, says Rashi. Previous Lamed Beis. Rashi L'Dorei Seichem. What does it mean? Mishmeres L'Dorei Seichem. What does it mean? You've got to preserve it for generations. Because Bimei Yirmiyahu, what happened was, and you look at Parak Beis in Yirmiyahu, you'll find this it's not described directly, but this is how the Mefarshim understand it. Yirmiyahu, in the second parak of Yirmiyahu, he turns around to the inhabitants of Yerushalayim, to the Bnei Yisrael, and says, why is it that you're not learning Torah? Why don't you follow the Torah? How can we do that? How can we take time off work to learn? How would we make a parnasa? So he produced for them the jar of the mon. He said to them, Hador atem re'u dvar Hashem. You see the word of Hashem. You saw the word of see. So he said, see the word of Hashem. See. Man is pozen is parnas Rabbi Seichem. Your ancestors were sustained with this. Harbi shluchin yesh lo lamokim. Hashem has many agents, many messengers, the ability to prepare food and sustenance for those who fear him. The idea is, as the Malbim points out in slightly more detail, the Malbim says here on this pasuk that because the pasuk begins with the words Zeh hadov asher tziva Hashem. This is the matter that Hashem has commanded. He says the idea of this command was to teach that the mon was not something which only applied in the midbar, in the desert. It was an inyan that remained forever. That someone who focuses themselves properly can always be considered me'ochle hamon. Through understanding what it means to receive the Torah, and to receive in the idea that parnasa ultimately comes from Hashem, this idea is something which is the key, the essence of the mon. The very fact that it's temporary, and the very fact that the way it's preserved is through the tzintzenes, is through looking at that jar that it will not continue forever. It will not be the ongoing miracle. It's the removal of the miracle. It's the removal of the nace that provides the greatest message. The greatest message is to be able to hold up that jar of the mon, like the waters of the Yam Suf coming back in, to hold up the jar of the mon and say, you see this nace, the real nace, is the fact that Hashem will always sustain you and provide for you going forward, even when you're not living according to in a miraculous way. Yirmiyahu Hanavi takes out that jar of mon from the Beis Hamikdash and he shows them when they say to him, how on earth can we make a living? And he responds to them and says, your ancestors managed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his ways. That's the lesson you need to learn. You're living on a different plane. You're living through the guidance of Hashem. That is the first of the three examples. The second example is a Ramban. A Ramban is on Perek Yud Zayin Posuk Hey. Yeah, Perek Yud Zayin Posuk Hey. The next episode. The next episode is Refidim. Refidim. They come to Refidim. Ve'ein mayim nishtos ha'om. So what happens? They don't have any water, so they complain. They give us mayim to nola mayim nishteh posuk beis. And Moshe says, "The Hashem. Why are you arguing with me? And why are you testing Hashem?" They complain. Why did you take us out from Egypt? Moshe cries to Hashem. They're going to stone me. Hashem says to Moshe, Avar lifnei ha'om. Posuk Hey. Vayom Hashem al Moshe, Avar lifnei ha'om. Pass in front of the people. Pass in front of the people. V'kach et chom ziknei Yisrael. Take with you the ziknei Yisrael matcha and your staff. Take this staff in your hand. Now, normally when we learn these psukim, we understand that we understand there was in front of them there was a tremendous nace. What was the nace? The nace was that Moshe Rabbeinu hits the rock, and therefore the rock produces water. The problem is, you look at the next pasuk. I will stand on the rock in Chorev. Where's Chorev? Not in Refidim. Chorev is a long way away. Chorev is where what's I think it's pointed as about a day's journey. Chorev is where Har Sinai is, right? That's what it is, Har Chorev, right? So what does it mean I'm standing in Chorev? You will hit the rock and the water will come out and the people will drink. And then it says, the eyes of the elders of Israel. So the Ramban notices this discrepancy, this difference. Refidim, Chorev. What's happening? Where's the rock? Is the rock with them or not with them? Again, it's just a simple thing. We just read the psukim and you notice these. You notice these differences. It's about 4 or 5 lines in to the Ramban on Posuk Hey. The people were located in Refidim, where they fought Amalek. The rock was in Chorev. Who Har Sinai? That's Har Sinai, he says. Either it was Har Sinai or it was the place of a city in front of Har Sinai, however you understand it. He had to go a long way away from the people to get to the rock. He had to go all the way to Chorev, very far away to get there. And that's why it says, pass away from the people, take with you the Ziknei Yisrael, you should go until you see where I am standing. Hashem says, where I am standing on the rock in Chorev. What happens then? He smites the rock in Chorev, and the water comes out. And it doesn't say, as it does in the other episode of the water and the rock, right? In Bamidbar, where it says, Vatesh to'eda uviron. They drank, and their animals drank. Doesn't say that here. Doesn't say that. Why? Clearly they did drink. What happened was like this, he says. They didn't go all the way to Chorev to drink. They didn't get to Har Sinai till later, right? They didn't get there now. They weren't there now. What they did was they sent people there to bring water for them, to bring them and to therefore bring that water to the camps. That's the idea. He then describes how the water flowed in rivers, went to them in Refidim, and that's how they were able to drink. And the point here is, again, apart from simply explaining just the simple explanation of the psukim, what is going on here, according to the Ramban, is the nace of the water does not take place in front of their eyes. The majority of the people don't even see it. The Ziknei Yisrael, there are a privileged few who see the miracle of the rock being struck and the water coming out. The rest of them, they have to have emunah in the final outcome. Moshe Rabbeinu says to them, leave it to me. He goes there, he meets Hashem in Chorev, the water comes out and flows to them. There are rivers that come to the Machane. It's another example where they have to learn that trust, the idea that they will not be able to live on that miraculous plane, the idea of living always as a nace. And of course, it has a nace at its heart. Here it has the miracle at its heart, the water coming out of the rock. But ultimately, it's done in such a way where they need to learn and understand that it won't always be like this. It won't always be in this miraculous way. And the third and final example is Amalek himself. The episode of Amalek, Rav Hirsch says like this. He says that if you look at every episode that has transpired, everything, he says, whether it's the what happens in Mora, the Mona, Shabbos, the water, everything is, he says, explaining to the people what their relationship with nature would be in the future. How effectively they would gain independence from the forces of nature by subjecting themselves to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is basically what we've been explaining. By understanding that they are under the direction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly, that is how they will understand that they can gain some measure of independence from nature itself. But he says there was one more experience they had to undergo. In that, he calls them the stages of preparation for Matan Torah. It was an experience which would teach them their standing as a people and as a nation among other nations. The idea that they would relate and how they would relate to the use of force itself. He links the episode with Amalek to Yaakov and Esau. Yaakov has to experience the idea and the ultimate, he has the ultimate victory, but everything about what transpires with that battle, of course, is a battle which represents the battle that his descendants will have. But Amalek represents Lo Yoreh Elokim, right? As it says in Devarim, doesn't fear Hashem. Amalek is even worse in this sense than Paroi, because Paroi, at least for Paroi, the interest is self-serving. It's in their own interest to keep slaves alive. They want the slaves for their own interest. There's a self-serving interest there. If it was in their interest to let the slaves go, to provide freedom, maybe they would do that too. It's all about their own interest. For Amalek, it is about force and force alone. He calls it the glory-seeking sword. That's all they want. They just want the violence itself. The idea of Amalek itself is to go against those who think that force is not always the way. Amalek thinks the sword is the only thing there is. That's what Amalek represents. There is no such concept for Amalek of not using the sword, of not using violence, and of not using force. And that is why Amalek comes along and fights in Refidim, where everyone else is afraid to do so. What happens? Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach. Right? After they defeat Amalek, Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach, Vayikro Shemai Hashem Nisi. Moshe builds a Mizbeach. Rav Hirsch notes a very powerful connection. When Yaakov defeats Esau, and he's given the name Yisrael, it says Vayatzev Shom Mizbeach. He builds a Mizbeach. He sets up a Mizbeach there as well, and he calls it Keil Elokei Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu here builds a Mizbeach too. Why? Because Amalek's power is the power of destruction. That's what Amalek is. Amalek is taking force for force's only sake. It's about destruction. It's about destroying. It's about violence, just for the sake of violence itself. The cruelty of Amalek. What is our mission? Our mission is Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach, to build, to understand that we're not here to destroy. We're here to build something. We're here to uplift things. The building of the Mizbeach symbolizes the idea that ultimately, the Mizbeach of Hashem will be the antithesis of the sword of Amalek. And what does he call it? Vayikro Shemai Hashem Nisi. Hashem is my nace. Hashem is my banner. Says Rav Hirsch, this nace is not a weapon. It's not a shield. It is a banner. Hashem tells me where to fight, where I need to direct my energies. That is the banner. Hashem Nisi, Hashem is my banner. The whole idea and the whole purpose is to fight against Amalek. And it's the ultimate lesson, the real ultimate lesson of what it means to understand the Shira as the returning of the water according to the forces of nature. The Bnei Yisrael have to understand, Klal Yisrael have to understand that they will live their lives based on the way Hashem wants them to live their lives in the natural world, not in the world of miracles. But the miracles, the miracle, the nace is Hashem Nisi. It's the banner. That's how the parsha ends. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, I am there for you. I am always holding up that banner for you to be able to follow. That idea of the constant nace, the constant miracle, the constant nace that accompanies them. So that they understand and they learn through this, that ultimately, what will lead to, as Chazal say, the complete throne of Hashem. You know, the last pasuk in the parsha, Ki Yod al Keiskar, there is a hand on the throne. The case is not spelled mole, it's not spelled completely. Instead of Kosmagala, it's missing the aleph. Ki Yod al Keiskar, Hashem Sholem, Kisei Sholem, Ad Shi Ovid Zichron, Ad Shi Ovid Zichron Shel Amalek. Until Amalek, the remembrance of Amalek perishes, the throne itself of Hashem cannot be complete, because ultimately. It is our ability to understand that by making ourselves subordinate to the will of Hashem, understanding that it's not about the might and power that we have. It's not about us living in a world where there will be a Kriyas Yamsuf all the time, whether we will be living on a miraculous plane. It's understanding that the completion of the Kisei, the completion of the throne of Hashem, is deliberately and specifically through the idea that we understand that Hashem is always there for us. Hashem is always Hashem Nisi. Hashem is my banner. So what I think we demonstrated through this idea, and as I said, the key for me was Rav Schwab and his idea of what the Shiur represents, the returning of the water, is that every stage in the Parsha is another step along the journey of what it means to live in this world, yet always be able to say Hashem Nisi. Hashem is guiding me. Hashem is my banner. Hashem is there for me. Even when I can't see the Kriyas Yamsuf, but I can see the water coming back. I can see the nature itself fulfilling a role and being there in the way that Hashem wants to guide it and what is the best way for me. That's the role of the Shira Sayom. That is the Tinsenes Hamon. That's the jar of Mon that he always holds up and says, remember this Mon, remember this jar. You're not going to see this all the time, but you'll always have it there. You'll remember what happened. Hashem is providing that guidance for you, that parnosa for you. That is the water which was elsewhere but came to them. And that is Amalek, the idea that Amalek destroys. But through understanding this, we always build. We have Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach. Wish you all a very, very good Shabbos.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you so much. Good
Good evening. Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.